The bones of the old colony were quiet. Wind moved through the broken walls of Ardin 7 the way it always had, slow, dry, carrying red dust that coated everything in a thin layer of rust-colored powder. Nothing lived there. Nothing was supposed to live there. The Empire had made sure of that 100 years ago, and the planet had simply accepted its new role as an empty place, a forgotten place, a place that did not show up on any current map worth reading. So when the sensor array aboard the patrol vessel Vrathsolune pinged a thermal cluster in Grid 7 of the southern ruins, the crew did not know what to think. Navigator DOS leaned over the console and read the numbers twice. 3 heat signatures, large ones, moving slightly but staying close together in one spot. He passed the reading to the ship's commander without saying a word, because there was no good word for what he was looking at. Commander Adrel studied the screen. She was a career officer, not young, not excitable. She had done frontier patrol for 18 years and had learned that strange readings were usually mundane things: native wildlife, equipment ghosts, atmospheric interference. She almost wrote it off. But the cluster was too warm, too organized, and too still. Wild animals moved. Whatever this was, it was staying in one place deliberately. She ordered a descent. The landing zone was a flat stretch of cracked ground about a quarter-kilometer from the thermal source. The crew came down in a small ground shuttle, 6 of them, armed but not in combat stance. Adrel led them through the ruins on foot. The broken walls rose on either side, old prefab construction, the kind that human colonies used to build fast and cheap. The Empire had catalogued this as a low-value settlement, agricultural and scientific. The kind of place nobody remembered until somebody needed to forget it. They heard the sound before they saw anything. It was not a roar, it was not a growl. It was something lower and quieter, and it took Adrel a moment to understand what it was. It was crying, not the way a wounded animal cried. It was the kind of sound that came from grief, from something that understood what it had lost. She came around the edge of a collapsed structure and stopped. 3 dragon hatchlings were curled around a grave. They were adolescent-sized, which for dragons meant each one was roughly the length of 2 shuttlecraft end to end. Their scales were dark, deep gray-green on the eldest, dusky amber on the middle one, and pale slate on the youngest. They were pressed against each other, wings folded in, and they were not moving except for the slow rise and fall of their breathing and the occasional tremor that ran through one of them when the sound rose and then faded. The grave itself was a simple thing, a rectangular mound of stones, carefully arranged, each one placed by hand. At the head stood a marker built from salvaged metal bent and welded into a flat slab, standing upright in the ground. Words had been scratched into its surface, not in Drakthari, not in any language of the Empire. Human Standard. Adrel could not read it. None of her crew could read it. The language had been extinct for 100 years, and the Empire had not seen a reason to keep it in standard translation archives. But the shape of the letters was there, careful, deliberate. Someone had taken time to do this correctly. The youngest hatchling noticed them first. He lifted his head slowly. His eyes were the color of deep water, and they were red around the edges, the way eyes get when something has been crying for a long time. He looked at the 6 armed officers standing at the edge of the ruins and did not move. He did not bare teeth. He did not spread his wings. He simply looked at them with an expression that Adrel, who had spent her whole career trying to read alien faces, recognized immediately. It was exhaustion. The eldest hatchling raised his head next. He was the largest of the 3, and he had something hanging around his neck on a cord, a small metal device, old and scratched, clearly hand-built. He looked at Adrel's crew the way someone looks at a thing they expected but did not particularly want to see yet. He took a slow breath. Then he spoke. He spoke in Imperial Drakthari first, with a clean and careful accent. Then he shifted into Galactic Common without pause, then into Vrath dialect, which was the regional variation used specifically in this sector of the frontier. He spoke it correctly. He said, "We know you need to take us. We are not going to fight you. We are asking for a little more time, please." Adrel did not respond for several seconds. In 18 years of frontier patrol, she had encountered 3 species that could speak Drakthari with that kind of fluency. None of them were dragons raised on an uninhabited dead world. None of them were hatchlings, and not one of them had ever opened a conversation with the word please. Behind her, one of her crew members very quietly said something under his breath that she did not catch. She stepped forward, not threatening. She looked at the grave marker, at the scratched human letters, at the three young dragons whose eyes were still red from crying. She thought about the scan that had brought them here, 3 heat signatures staying still. Grief did not move. Grief stayed where the thing it mourned was buried. She said, "Take your time." The middle hatchling, the amber-scaled one, looked up sharply. She seemed surprised. She studied Adrel the way someone studies a thing they are not sure they trust yet, and then she looked back at the grave. The youngest one tucked his head back down against the stone. They stayed another hour. Adrel's crew waited at a distance. Nobody spoke much. The red dust moved through the ruins and settled on the grave marker and on the dark scales of the 3 hatchlings and on the shoulders of 6 officers who had come to a dead world expecting nothing and found something none of them had words for. When the eldest finally rose, he tucked the little metal device against his chest and picked up a battered box that had been sitting beside the grave, hidden between his foreleg and the stones. He walked toward Adrel steadily. The other 2 followed. He said, "We are ready." Adrel nodded. She led them back toward the shuttle. She did not report the details over open channel on the way back. She used a secured line and marked it priority restricted. She told her superior that they had found 3 unregistered hatchlings on Ardin 7, alive and fluent in multiple languages, beside a human grave. She waited through the silence on the other end of the line. Then her superior said, "Repeat that." She repeated it. Another silence. "Then do not let anyone else near that site. Bring them in. Say nothing further until you have a direct order." Adrel looked back through the shuttle's rear viewport as they lifted off. The ruins of Ardin 7 grew small beneath them. The grave was too far away to see anymore, but she knew it was there. She knew exactly what the letters on that marker meant, even if she could not read them. Someone had died down there. Someone had been remembered. And 3 young dragons who spoke better Drakthari than half the officers in the fleet had been the ones doing the remembering. Her superior's voice came back on the line, tight and controlled. "Get them to the capital, quietly." Adrel set the course and said nothing more. The observation chamber aboard the transit vessel was built for holding things the Empire did not yet have a category for. It was not a cell. The walls were too smooth, the lighting too careful, the air too filtered for that. It was more like a room designed by someone who wanted to seem polite while still making sure nothing left without permission. There were reinforced walls behind the decorative panels. There were sensors in the ceiling dressed up to look like ventilation grates. Archivist Voss noted all of this when he was given the assignment, because Voss noticed everything and wrote most of it down. He was 32 years into his archival career. He had catalogued extinct species, filed reports on dead civilizations, and once spent 4 months documenting the linguistic drift of a colony that had been cut off from the Empire for 60 years. He was, by most measures, the most boring dragon in any room he entered. He had been chosen for this assignment because he was thorough, discreet, and unlikely to panic. He walked into the observation chamber carrying a recording case and a translation tablet he did not end up needing. The 3 hatchlings were sitting in a loose triangle near the far wall, not huddled, not defensive, simply sitting the way people sit when they have been waiting for something they knew was coming. The eldest one watched him enter. The amber-scaled middle one was looking at the wall. The youngest was holding a small flat stone in both front paws, turning it over and over. Voss set his case down. He introduced himself. He told them his role. He told them the purpose of the interview, using careful, neutral language that he had rehearsed on the walk over. The eldest said, "My name is Sorath. The one looking at the wall is Kira. The one with the stone is Drawl. You do not need to be nervous. We understand why we are here." Voss had not realized he was being nervous. He made a note to review his body language. He began with the standard questions: origin, age estimate, clan registration. The answers were not standard. Sorath answered calmly. They had been born on Ardin 7. They did not have clan registration because they had never been registered. They did not know their birth parents. The eggs had been found in the debris zone of the old settlement near the edge of what had once been the colony's outer wall. They had been found by Aldrich. Voss wrote down the name. Who is Aldrich? Kira turned from the wall at that. She looked at Voss with amber eyes that were still slightly raw at the edges. He was the one who raised us, she said. He was human. The word landed in the room and did not move. Voss kept his pen on the paper. He kept his breathing even. He was an archivist. He had spent 32 years training himself to receive information without reacting to it before he had written it down. He wrote down the word human and underlined it once, which was more than he usually did. Then he asked them to tell him about Aldrich. What came out over the next 3 hours was not an interview. It was something closer to a portrait, built from 3 voices that kept filling in each other's gaps. Sorath gave the structure of things, dates, sequences, facts. Kira gave the feeling of things, what it was like, what it meant, why it mattered. Droll gave the details, the small specific things that nobody would have remembered unless they had been paying very close attention to every moment of their life, which Droll apparently had. Aldrich had been a colonial engineer. He had designed water filtration systems for the Ardin 7 settlement. He had been underground when the Empire came, not hiding deliberately, but doing maintenance work in the sub-level pipes, and the noise of the bombardment had been muffled enough that by the time he understood what was happening, it was already over. He had come up into silence and dust. He had spent 3 days looking for survivors and found none. He had been the only one. He lived alone in the ruins for years. Voss did not ask how many years, and none of them specified. What mattered was that he had survived, and then one day he found 3 dragon eggs in the debris near the outer wall. The eggs were cold. They should have been dead. He was an engineer, not a biologist, but he understood heat and insulation, and he built something to keep them warm, and 2 weeks later all 3 cracked open. He cried, Droll said, still turning the stone over. He told us that later. He said he cried for a long time before he picked any of us up. He did not say why exactly. I think he was scared. He was alone for a very long time, Sorath said. Finding something alive probably felt strange. Kira said nothing. She was looking at the floor. He named them on the 3rd day. He kept a journal from the beginning. He taught himself to sleep in short intervals because hatchlings needed constant attention, and he was one person. He built them a pen from salvaged materials, then a proper shelter, then a larger one when they grew. He taught them to speak by speaking to them constantly, narrating everything he did the way someone talks to a creature they are certain is listening even before it can respond. By the time they were old enough to understand complex language, they were already fluent in human standard. He added Imperial Drakthari from a language archive he had saved to a data stick before the colony was destroyed. He added Galactic Common from a second archive. He used textbooks, recordings, anything on the data stick. He drilled them until they were better than he was, and then he made them teach the material back to him so they would not forget it. He taught them engineering, basic medicine, astronomy, history, cooking, agriculture, music badly, Droll noted. He was not good at music, but he tried anyway, and ethics. He had a lot to say about ethics, Kira said quietly. He never told us to be angry. He never told us to hate. He talked about it sometimes like he was working something out for himself. What was fair, what was worth doing, what a person owed to the world they lived in. She paused. He said species were not good or evil. He said individuals chose. Voss had filled 16 pages. His handwriting had gotten smaller and smaller as the interview went on, as though he was trying to fit more onto each line. He asked about the box. Sorath reached beside him and brought it forward. It was old metal, dented at the corners, with a simple latch. Inside were journals, actual physical journals, handwritten on paper that Aldrich had manufactured himself from plant pulp because his data storage had been nearly full by the end. There were also audio recordings on small chips, and Sorath had a player for them that Aldrich had built, fitted to be operated by a claw rather than human fingers. There was a final recording. Sorath held it up. He made this in his last 2 weeks, he said. He knew he was very old. He said this one was not for us. Voss looked at it. He said it was for whoever came after, Sorath continued. He said someone would come eventually. He said to give it to the first person who asked the right questions. Voss put down his pen. What are the right questions? Kira said, you asked about him, not about us, not about what we are or what we know or what we can do. You asked who he was. She looked at Voss steadily. That was the right question. Sorath set the chip on the table between them. Voss picked it up. He turned it over in his palm. His hand was steady, but only because he had trained it to be. He pressed play. The voice that came out was old. A human voice, thin and slow, the way very old voices get, but clear. It had an accent he had never heard before, a human standard accent on top of decades of speaking other languages, blended into something entirely its own. It said, you found them, good. A pause. I have been trying to decide what to say to you for about 3 years now, and I keep changing my mind, so I am going to say the simple version. I raised 3 dragons. I did my best. They are good people. If you are listening to this, please treat them like it. Another pause, longer. I'm not going to ask you to feel bad about what happened here. You probably already do, or you probably never will, and neither of those is something I can fix from a grave. What I am asking is smaller than that. Just look at them. Look at what they are. And then ask yourself how something like that was possible. The recording ended. The chamber was very quiet. Voss sat with the chip in his hand for a long time. Then he looked up at the 3 hatchlings, at Sorath sitting steady, at Kira, who had turned back to the wall again with her jaw tight, at Drawl, who had finally stopped turning the stone. He thought about his 32 years of cataloging things that used to exist. He thought about an engineer on a dead world who had kept going anyway. He picked up his pen and turned to a new page. Tell me more, he said. Rain came to Draxol the morning the hatchlings arrived. It was not unusual rain. The capital world was old and cold and grey for most of the year, and the great stone structures of the Imperial quarter shed water like they had always done in long curtains off carved ledges into channels built before any living dragon could remember who had ordered them dug. The city smelled of wet rock and altitude. The clouds sat low over the Tribunal hall's roof, and the flags on the outer towers, Imperial red and gold, hung heavy and still. Inside, the hall was dry and bright and very formal. The Tribunal had been called quietly, no public notice, no announcement in the Imperial press. 7 senior commanders sat at the curved stone bench that formed the front wall of the chamber. Grand Warden Ardin sat at the center. He was the oldest dragon in the room by a significant margin. 340 years had put silver through his deep red scales and made his eyes the kind of careful that only comes from having seen too much and thought hard about most of it. He had presided over border courts, fleet reviews, planetary assessments. He had a reputation for being precise. He did not look precise this morning. He looked like a dragon who had not slept. On one side of the chamber, Marshal Death stood near the administrative bench. He was younger than Ardin by 2 centuries, large and green-black, with the kind of posture that said he considered every room he entered to be already his. He had been pushing since the report arrived to have the matter handled quickly. Contained was the word he kept using. The situation should be contained. Archivist Voss sat in the observer section. He had not been assigned a speaking role. He had brought his notes anyway, all 16 pages plus the 3 additional pages he had written the night before while he could not sleep either. The 3 hatchlings were brought in from a side entrance. They walked in together, Sorath first, Kira to his right, Drawl a half-step behind. They had been given space to rest, and they had used it, because the raw redness around their eyes had faded somewhat, and they walked with their heads up. Sorath still had the translation device around his neck. He still carried the box. Ardin looked at them. He had been told what to expect from the preliminary report. He had thought he was prepared. Looking at 3 young dragons walk into an Imperial tribunal with the quiet self-possession of people who had already made their peace with hard things that was different from reading about it. The proceedings began with formality, identification, status, the legal classification of unregistered hatchlings found on uninhabited frontier territory. Death's counsel laid it out precisely: no clan, no lineage record, no empire birth documentation, raised by a member of a species classified in the Imperial record as both extinct and historically adversarial. Therefore, legally, the hatchlings held no standing as recognized persons under Imperial code. The logic was airtight, the law was clear, Death had been thorough. Sorath listened to all of it without moving. When Death's counsel finished, Sorath asked, in a polite and level voice, whether he was permitted to ask a question. Orin said he was. Sorath said, "If humans are classified as extinct, then the classification describes something that has already been done, not something that happened on its own. Who did it?" No one answered. Sorath did not press the point. He sat back. Orin called Kira to speak. She stood. She was the middle child, the amber one, and she had the kind of presence that took up more space than her size explained. She did not have notes. She did not gesture or perform. She stood in the center of the chamber and told them about Aldrich. Not the tragedy of him, not the injustice of what had been done to his people. She told them the plain details of who he was. She said he woke early because he said the mornings on Ardin 7 were the nicest part of the day before the heat came. She said he kept a record of every crop he grew and measured his yields with more care than most professional agricultural stations. She said he argued with himself out loud sometimes when he was trying to solve an engineering problem, two different voices with two different opinions, and then he would stop and laugh at himself. She said he never wasted food because he had learned the value of it. She said he taught them to count not in abstract numbers, but in things: seeds, tools, days, repairs needed. She said he told them once that the most important skill a person could have was to look at a thing that was broken and believe, before they had any evidence, that it could be fixed. She said he never spoke about what had happened to his people with anger. He spoke about it the way you speak about a storm, something that came, something that did damage, something that you survived and had to build after. He was afraid sometimes, she said. In the night, we could hear it. He never talked about it in the day. Sorath used to stay awake and sit near his shelter on the nights when it was bad. He never told Aldrich. He just sat nearby. She stopped. She said he made us promise we would not carry his death into everything we did. He said the future was not the right place to put old grief. He said you could honor someone without letting what happened to them become your whole story. She looked at Orin. She said, "We are trying to keep that promise. I want you to know it is harder today than it was yesterday." Orin said nothing. He wrote something on the paper in front of him. Death's counsel moved forward again. The points of law were restated. The classification was firm. The risk of allowing unregistered hatchlings raised outside Imperial understanding, with access to sealed historical material contained in those journals to move freely through the capital, was significant. Containment was the appropriate measure while the Senate reviewed the broader implications. A sealed file on Ardin 7 was already in place. That file should remain sealed. Voss stood up. He was not supposed to stand up. He was an observer. Orin looked at him. The room looked at him. Death looked at him with the particular expression of someone calculating consequences. Voss said, "I object formally to the administrative sealing of the Ardin 7 historical record. I am citing Research Statute 41, Subarticle 9, which requires that any documented first contact event, including contact with a species previously classified as extinct, must be entered into open academic record within 1 standard year of discovery." He paused. "I am also citing Statute 67, which protects documentation provided voluntarily by a sentient party during official interview from being reclassified as sealed material after the fact." He sat back down. His hands were flat on his knees. He was breathing carefully. Droll was looking at him. Droll said quietly to Sorath, in a voice just loud enough to carry to the nearest bench, "Aldrich said to watch for people who do the right thing when it costs them something. He paused. He called them the ones worth trusting. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Ardin called a recess. He walked out through the side corridor to the rain-facing window that looked out over the lower city, and he stood there for a long time. The city was grey and wet below him. He had lived here for most of his 340 years. He had watched it grow. He had helped build some of what he was looking at. He thought about the report from Ardin 7, 3 hatchlings, a human grave, a box of journals. He thought about 100 years ago when he had been a young officer and a very senior commander had handed him a document to co-sign, and he had co-signed it without reading it carefully enough, and he had told himself later that it was a military matter, a strategic decision, something above his pay grade to second guess. He thought about the word contained. He went back inside and sat down and called the session to order. He did not sleep that night either. The Imperial Archive was the kind of place that was proud of how much it held and careful about who could see it. It occupied 7 levels below the main administrative wing of the capital, and it smelled of stone and cool air and the particular dry stillness of old records kept at regulated temperature. Voss had worked here for years. He knew which terminals ran slow, which subindex routes skipped steps, and which sealed record flags could be challenged by academic statute without triggering an automatic security alert. He had never used that knowledge for anything that would have concerned his supervisors. He was using it now. Sorath sat beside him at the secondary terminal. The hatchling was too large for the chair and had settled onto the floor instead, reading the screen with his neck extended and his posture still and patient. Voss had expected to explain everything. Sorath had instead explained 2 things to Voss about the archive's cross-reference structure that Voss had not known after 32 years. They did not talk much while they worked. They did not need to. The Ardin 7 file had been sealed under a military administrative joint order dated 98 years ago. The seal had 2 authorization signatures. One of them Voss did not recognize. The other was Ardin's. Sorath saw Voss notice it. He said nothing. The file itself was broken into sections. Voss pulled them open one at a time, reading quickly, taking notes. The first sections were standard location data, colony census information, resource surveys. The colony had been a settlement of roughly 3,000 people, agricultural and scientific. They had been on Ardin 7 for 11 years before the Empire came. The children born there in that time had never known another home. The 4th section was where the order was. It was formal. It used proper legal language throughout. It described the Ardin 7 colony as a security threat, a potential point of contact for hostile alien factions seeking to use human networks as an intelligence asset against Imperial frontier interests. The language was careful and specific, and reading it after reading Aldrich's journals felt like something built to sound correct rather than to be correct. Voss read the threat assessment section twice. There was no supporting evidence, not one cited incident, not one documented contact with a hostile faction, not one intercepted communication or suspicious action on record. The threat was asserted without proof and then used to authorize a military response. The response was described in a single clause at the end of the 3rd paragraph. Sorath read it at the same time Voss did. His expression did not change. His jaw tightened once and then relaxed. Voss kept reading. In the 7th section, buried beneath 3 levels of administrative cross-reference that would have taken hours to navigate without Sorath's help, he found the economic report. It had been commissioned 8 months before the military order was issued. It detailed the mineral composition of Ardin 7's lower geological strata. The numbers were significant, the kind of significant that explained why a low-value agricultural colony had received any Imperial attention at all. The report had been filed by a senior resource officer. That officer had, 6 months after Ardin 7, received a significant promotion. Voss sat back. He had spent his career believing that most things had complicated explanations, that institutions, even flawed ones, were usually driven by tangled motives, fear, and politics and miscalculation, and the way decisions that seem logical in a crisis look different 30 years later. He still believed that was mostly true. It was not true here. 3,000 people had been killed because someone wanted what was under their ground and did not want to share it. The threat assessment had been invented afterward to make the paperwork correct. And then the record had been sealed, and the species had been reclassified as extinct and hostile, and the Empire had moved on. Sorath said very quietly, "There are more." Voss looked at him. Sorath directed him to a linked archive, a subindex of frontier operations from the same decade. 7 more settlements, 7 more files with the same structure, thin threat assessments with no supporting evidence, resource surveys filed months before the military orders, promotions after. Different worlds, different details, the same shape. Voss sat with that for a long moment. 3,000 people had not been a tragedy, they had been a pattern. He pushed the thought aside, because if he sat in it, he would not be able to keep working, and he needed to keep working. He moved to the communication logs section instead, the low-priority, outer-frontier traffic, the kind of data that accumulated without anyone reading it carefully because it came from nowhere important. It took 40 minutes to find the first signal. It was faint, irregular timing, an encoded packet in a format that was not used anywhere in the current Empire, an older format, human standard encoding from a pre-Empire specification. The timestamp was 63 years ago. Voss stared at it. Then he found another, 41 years ago. Then 3 more in a cluster from 22 years back. Then 1 from 11 years ago, brief and quiet, from a point source in a different outer system entirely. His pen stopped moving. He said slowly, "They survived." Sorath said, "Some of them." Voss turned to look at him. "You knew." Aldrich believed it was possible. He said when a species is determined enough, they find ways. Sorath looked at the screen. He did not know for certain. He said he would rather believe it and be wrong than not believe it and be right. He paused. He also said that if any of us ever found proof, we should reach back. Voss thought about what reaching back meant. He thought about the sealed file. He thought about death and his word contained and the economic report from the 7th section. He thought about Voss's own signature that was not in any of these files, but probably should have been, in the form of a question asked years ago that he had not asked. Sorath turned from the screen and looked at him directly. "We need to send a reply. I have the encoding format from Aldrich's archive. I know what to say." He paused. "I need to know if you will help us." Voss looked at his notes. 42 pages now, the Ardin 7 file, 7 other files, 11 years of silence from a hidden signal somewhere in the outer dark. He thought about the recording. "You found them. Good." He said, "What do you want to say to them?" Sorath said, 3 words, in human standard. He wrote them on Voss's notepad. Voss read them. He breathed out slowly through his nose. He turned to the communication terminal and began building the encoded packet. His hands were steady. He had not trained them to be steady. They just were, which surprised him. While he worked, Sorath turned to the door and called quietly to the corridor where Kira and Drawl had been waiting. They came in. Kira read the message on the notepad. She looked at the screen. She looked at Voss's hands on the keys. Drawl sat down beside the terminal and watched it the way you watch something you have been waiting to see for your entire life without knowing it. Voss finished the packet. His finger rested on the send key for a moment. He pressed it. The signal went out into the outer dark, slim and quiet, and encoded in a language the Empire had tried to erase. 3 words, aimed at a ghost signal from 11 years ago, sent to a point in space where something or someone had once been. Drawl said, barely above a whisper, "He said they would come eventually. He said we just had to stay visible." Kira said, "We found you." She repeated it in human standard, the words rough in her mouth, accent tilted the way it always was when she used a language built for a smaller vocal range. But the words were right. Behind them, in Voss's 42 pages of careful handwriting, the shape of something enormous sat in ink. The signal was gone. The archive was silent. The rain outside had stopped at some point while they were working, and none of them had noticed. Voss looked at his notes one more time. He picked up the stack of pages and quietly sent a copy to the academic network under Research Statute 41. Then he looked at Sorath and said, "What happens now?" Sorath said, "Now you go back to the Tribunal and tell them what you found." Voss nodded. He picked up his case. He straightened his notes. He walked to the door. He stopped. He was right, he said, without turning around, about individuals choosing. He left. Sorath looked at the screen for a moment longer. Then he closed it. Outside, somewhere in the outer systems, 11 years of silence waited to answer. The news moved faster than the Empire wanted it to. By the time the Tribunal reconvened on the third morning, the academic network had already begun to discuss the Ardin 7 historical documentation that had appeared under Research Statute 41. Discussion was a mild word for it. The archive community was not large, but it was connected, and 32 years of colleagues who trusted archivist Voss's name on a document began sharing what they had read. A political science professor at the Draxol Institute sent a summary to her colleagues. One of her colleagues knew a journalist. The journalist did not yet understand the full shape of the story, but knew enough to know it was one. Voss was placed under administrative review before he reached the tribunal hall. He was informed of this by a courier who caught him in the corridor and read the notice in a low voice. Voss thanked him politely and kept walking. Outside the hall, a small group of dragons stood in the grey morning. Not a crowd, not yet, but a group. Young scholars and researchers mostly, standing quietly with nothing in their hands, looking at the building. It was the kind of protest that does not shout because it does not yet know if it is a protest. Inside, the 7 tribunal commanders were already seated. Death stood at his usual position near the administrative bench. He had the tight and precise posture of someone who had spent the night preparing. He looked at Voss when the archivist entered and held that look for exactly 2 seconds, and then he looked away. The hatchlings were brought in. Sorath, Kira, Drawl, same order as before, heads up. Death's council moved immediately. The academic publication of restricted material was a violation of archive handling protocols. Voss's action was grounds for removal from the proceedings. The Ardin 7 records needed to be reclassified and the academic copies pulled. Orin listened to all of it. Then he set down the document in front of him and looked at the chamber. He said, "Before we proceed further, I need to take the floor as a witness." Death looked at him. The other 6 commanders looked at him. In 200 years of Imperial Tribunal record, the presiding commander had not done this. Orin said, "Under Tribunal Protocol 14, a presiding officer may temporarily recuse themselves and speak in a factual capacity when their personal knowledge is directly relevant to the matter being adjudicated. I am invoking that protocol." He stood. He walked around the curved bench to the speaking floor. He was a large dragon, 340 years' worth of presence, and when he stood in the open space of the chamber, he made it feel smaller than it was. He spoke for a long time. He talked about 98 years ago when he was a fleet officer attached to the Frontier Expansion Division. He talked about the document he had co-signed. He said he had read it the way a person reads something they have already been told is necessary quickly in the direction of agreement. He named the senior commander who had handed it to him. He named the resource officer whose report had preceded the military order. He described what he had been told and what he had chosen not to ask. He spoke without looking at notes. He had them, but he did not use them. The chamber was completely still. He said, "I have told myself for 100 years that I was following a chain of command, that the decision was not mine to make, that the war and the frontier and the pressure of that period made it reasonable to trust a document I had not fully examined." He paused. "I believed that for a long time. Looking at 3 hatchlings raised by the last man I helped to orphan, I find I no longer believe it." He said, "I am giving this tribunal my personal logs from that period. I am naming every officer I know to have been involved. I am asking that this matter be elevated to a full Senate review, and I am stepping down as presiding commander of this tribunal because I am not a neutral party and I should not have been called to be one." He walked back around the bench and sat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Death's counsel said that this was procedurally extraordinary and the admissibility of personal testimony from a presiding commander who had just recused himself was legally unclear, and the Senate review process was a months-long procedure that did not affect the immediate legal standing of the Hatchlings. He was correct about most of that. Sorath said, "May I speak?" The temporary chair, the second eldest tribunal commander, who had inherited the role in the sudden silence of Orin's action, said yes. Sorath stood. He did not go to the floor. He spoke from where he was. He said he was not going to talk about Ardin 7 or the sealed files or the numbers in the economic report. He said Voss and Orin had done that already and had done it better than he could. He said he wanted to talk about Aldrich. He talked about a specific afternoon when he was small, when a storm had knocked down the shelter wall they had spent 2 weeks building, and Aldrich had sat down in the mud and laughed. Not the kind of laugh that hides crying, the real kind. He laughed until Sorath started laughing too, and then Kira, and Drawl just watched them all with the expression he always had when he thought everyone around him had lost their minds. Then Aldrich got up and started rebuilding. He talked about the time Kira had flown for the first time. She had been terrified, and then she was in the air, and then she was 50 meters up and screaming with joy, and Aldrich was on the ground below watching her with his hand over his mouth and his shoulders shaking. Sorath had thought he was scared. Then Aldrich lowered his hand, and Sorath saw his face. He was not scared. He was the proudest a person's face could get. He talked about the last months. Aldrich had slowed down. He had begun transferring everything in his head to physical record, working methodically through everything he had ever learned, every detail of the colony, every person he had known. He built and labeled and documented with the same care he had given to everything else. He was an engineer. He solved for the future even when he was running out of one. Sorath said, "He told us once that humans were not special because of any physical ability. He said humans were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most durable, not the most intelligent species they had ever encountered. He said what humans were good at was caring about things they had no logical reason to care about. He said his people had looked at the universe for as long as they could and kept finding things to love in it." He paused. Then he said that was probably why someone wanted to get rid of them. The chamber was very quiet. "He did not raise us to argue with you," Sorath said. "He raised us to show you that it was possible. One person, alone, with nothing left, found a reason to keep going. He found 3 reasons, actually. He kept going until there were 3 of us who could go forward without him." He sat. The temporary chair called a short recess, and then called it off when it became clear that no one in the room knew what to do with a recess right now. Death made one final legal motion. It was well argued. The chamber voted on it. 4 of the 6 remaining commanders voted against it. Death went very still and very quiet. 2 weeks later, his personal records were pulled in the course of the Senate review. A subfile was found showing that 8 years ago, a preliminary survey drone over Ardin 7 had returned readings consistent with possible underground biological habitation. Death had issued a re-sterilization order without authorization, without documentation, without informing anyone. He had done it alone, in a private communication, to erase something before it could be found. Whatever the drone had detected, Death had made certain nothing would be there if anyone looked closer. He was removed from command before the tribunal even issued its formal ruling. The charges were still being assembled when the story fully broke open. By then, the small group outside the tribunal hall had become something larger, spread across 3 major cities on Draxol. It was still quiet, mostly. It was still the kind of thing that asked questions before it made demands. But it was asking. In a secured room on the transit vessel, which had become a permanent docking fixture in the capital port, while the proceedings continued, Drawl sat alone with a piece of paper and a pen. He was writing. He had been writing for several hours. Sorath found him there after the session ended and looked at the pages. It was Aldrich's songs, all of them transcribed from memory. The words and the notes, written in both human standard and the closest approximation in Drakthari notation. Even the three songs Aldrich had been particularly bad at. Drawl said, without looking up, someone should have them correct. Sorath sat beside him and said nothing. Outside the port's viewport, Draxol's grey clouds were beginning to break. 6 months did not fix anything. It was important to say that plainly, because the kind of stories that end neatly in 6 months were not this kind of story. The Senate review was ongoing, slow, and contested in the way that all true accounting is slow and contested, because the people who benefited from a version of the past do not surrender it quickly. There were hearings. There were counter-filings. There were 3 separate attempts to reclassify the Ardin 7 documentation under security frameworks that would have put it back in a sealed archive under a different name. Each one failed, but each one had to be failed separately by different people in different rooms, and it took time and effort that could have been used for other things. But 6 months also did not fix nothing. The reply came 41 days after Voss sent the signal. It was short. It was in human standard, and Sorath translated it himself, slowly, holding the playback device to his ear with his eyes closed. It contained a location, a general one, deliberately vague, not quite a place but a direction. It contained a question. It contained a very long silence after the question, long enough that Sorath at first thought the message had ended, and then a voice finished the sentence it had started. The question was, are you safe? There were 7 surviving human communities. That number was not confirmed for another 2 months because they did not trust quickly and they were right not to. The largest group was fewer than 20,000 people. The smallest was 43. They had been surviving in the outer systems for a century, some on hidden stations, some on uncharted worlds, some as crew aboard vessels that moved constantly and never docked at an Imperial port. Some of them had been born after Ardin 7. Some of them were old enough to remember the names of people who had not survived. They came to the first meeting with Sorath, Kira, and Drawl because the message had been in their own language, and the 3 words had been the right 3 words. They came to the second meeting because Sorath had described Aldrich to them, and one woman in the group, very old and very still, had recognized his name and put her hands over her face and sat that way for a long time. The negotiations were fragile. The Empire was large and had done what it had done, and a formal review and a Senate hearing, and the removal of one marshal did not erase that. The humans said as much, directly and without apology, and the 3 hatchlings said they understood, and they did not rush. Aldrich had been a patient man. He had taught them patience the way he taught everything, not as a lesson, but as a practice. He had done it every day, in the way he approached problems, in the way he kept working after setbacks, in the way he sat with them in the evenings, even when he was tired, and answered questions he had answered before, because the question was being asked by someone who needed to hear the answer for themselves. Sorath and Kira and Drawl became the first interspecies diplomatic liaisons in Imperial history by a process that nobody had planned for and nobody could quite explain in retrospect, the way some things happen not because someone designed them, but because they were the only things that made sense. The Empire needed something the hatchlings were. The humans needed someone the Empire was not. The hatchlings were somewhere in between, and they had been built for it by a man who could not have known that was what he was doing. Voss's administrative review was dropped 3 months in, when pursuing it would have required the Empire to officially argue that the research statutes under which he had acted were invalid, which would have unraveled several other cases currently in the Empire's favor. He was offered a departmental promotion that included a new office and a larger staff. He declined it. He requested instead a formal assignment as Chief Archivist of the Ardin 7 Historical Record Project, which was a role that did not yet exist and would need to be created. The request was granted eventually after it was also denied and then regranted. He spent the next 4 years doing the work properly. He found names, 3,012 names, from colony registrations and personal correspondence, and the manifests of the ships that had brought people to Ardin 7 in the years before the Empire came. He documented each one with whatever information existed. He cross-referenced across 7 other sites where the same pattern had played out. He sent Sorath regular updates, not because it was required, but because he thought Sorath should know. Orin retired from active command 6 weeks after the Tribunal closed. He did not do it quietly. He gave a formal address before his division that was later reproduced in the academic press, in which he said several things that were uncomfortable and true. He moved to a smaller house in the lower district of the capital. He sent Sorath's household a message. It read, "Tell me what he was like. I want to know who I owe." Drawl wrote back. He wrote a long letter, 12 pages, covering everything from the way Aldrich organized his tools by frequency of use rather than by type, to the specific sound his voice made when he was proud of something and trying not to show it too obviously. He described the garden Aldrich had kept and what he had grown in it and why. He described the songs, including a note about which ones were good and which ones Aldrich sang anyway because he liked them regardless. He wrote at the end, he would not want you to owe him anything. He said debt was a bad foundation for anything you wanted to last. He would want to know you did better going forward. That is something you can still do. Orin read the letter more than once. He did not reply immediately, which Sorath told Drawl probably meant it had landed. The Imperial delegation traveled to Ardin 7 in the 5th month. It was not a grand procession, 2 vessels, a small formal party from the Senate Review Committee, Voss, whose presence was not officially required but who came anyway, Commander Adrell, who had been the one to find the hatchlings and who had asked to be included in a request she submitted 3 times before it was approved. And the humans, 11 of them, chosen carefully by the 7 communities as the ones who would make this first step on behalf of all of them. They came on their own vessel, a small and battered thing that had kept them alive for years, and they docked cautiously and came aboard the Imperial transport with the specific kind of stillness that belongs to people who have been hunted and have not forgotten it. Sorath met them at the entrance. Kira stood beside him. Drawl was at the back, which was his preferred position. The oldest woman in the human group looked at the 3 of them for a long time. She said something in human standard. Sorath translated it later as, "He was a good man." Kira told him afterward that the direct translation was more like, "Of course it was him." She thought that was probably closer to what the woman meant. They landed on Ardin 7 in the late afternoon, when the red light came across the plains at a low angle and turned everything the color of old embers. The ruins of the settlement were smaller and quieter than Sorath remembered from the outside, but inside the shape of them was exactly the same. He walked the paths he knew, past the old water filtration building, past the corner where Aldrich had grown his best season of grain, past the 3 stones they had stacked as children in a game and never moved. His feet remembered even when he was not thinking about where they were going. The grave was where they had left it. The stones were the same. The metal marker was the same, slightly more weathered, the letters still legible if you knew the language. The red dust had settled over everything in a thin, even layer, the way it always did. It had settled on the grave and on the marker, and it looked, if you let yourself see it that way, like the planet had been keeping the place covered and quiet while everyone was gone. The Imperial delegation erected the monument beside the grave. It was stone, real stone brought from Draxol, shaped simply without decoration. The carving on it had taken 2 weeks to get right, because Sorath had been specific about what it should say and how, and he had sent corrections until it was correct. It read in both Imperial Draxthari and Human Standard. He raised 3 dragons and asked nothing in return. He is why they came back speaking our language. The humans read it, some of them quietly, some of them not. The oldest woman knelt beside the grave and stayed there for a while, and no one moved or spoke around her. When Kira landed beside the grave in the last hour before dark, she did it alone. The others had moved a short distance away by unspoken agreement because some things were not for an audience. She folded her wings and sat the way she used to sit when she was small and he was beside her, her weight settled back on her haunches, her head slightly bowed. She talked to him. She told him what had happened in 6 months, the way you give someone a summary of a long, complicated thing when you do not want to bore them, but you want them to know. She told him the negotiations were hard, and she was not going to pretend they were not. She told him about the old woman who had recognized his name, and she said she thought he would have liked her. She told him she had met a young human man from one of the outer communities who had been born after Ardin 7, who had grown up knowing nothing but hiding and moving and the edge of survival, and who had sat across from her at the second meeting and looked at her steadily and asked, in a voice that did not shake, what the Empire was prepared to guarantee in concrete terms and not in sentiment. She said she had answered him directly, the way Aldrich had taught her to answer direct questions, and she said the conversation after that had been the most useful one she had yet had with anyone on either side. She told him Drawl had written down all the songs. She told him that included the bad ones and that she had argued about that, but Drawl said a record should be complete, and she had eventually agreed because Drawl was usually right even when he was irritating. The red light flattened and went gold, and then the stars came out over Ardin 7 one by one, the way they always had, the way they had when Aldrich used to take them outside on clear nights and point out the ones he knew the names of and make up names for the ones he did not. Kira looked at the grave for a long time after the light was gone. She said, "We are all right." She said, "It is not finished, it is not close to finished, but it is started, and you always said starting was the hard part." She sat a while longer, not crying. She had done that. This was something else, the kind of quiet that comes after grief has had its time and life has started requiring you to be present for it again. She told him she was going to go be present for it. She spread her wings and lifted into the night, and below her the grave sat in the dark with its monument beside it, and the red dust of Ardin 7 settled over both of them equally, patient and fine, the way it had been settling over this ground for 100 years and would keep settling long after all of them were done. The stars were out. The world was quiet. Somewhere far out in the dark, in 7 scattered hidden places, people who had been surviving in the dark for 100 years were still reading a message that said 3 words. "We found you." And slowly, carefully, one careful step at a time, they were starting to believe it.